Hi everyone, and this is going to be our final online lecture of the semester, so congrats on making it this far. And we're going to dig into a slightly different kind of validity topic, which is the logic of temporal validity. And we're going to look at how temporal validity threatens research in general, but particularly research on social media effects. So let's start with what is temporal validity. So this is a kind of validity that refers to the extent to which a study's findings remain accurate and useful across time. And that's even as people, technologies, platforms, and social contexts might change. So we're no longer just thinking about, what is the cause and effect relationship in the study, and is this effect going to generalize to other contexts? But we're going to be thinking about a particular form of generalizability that's looking at how long are these effects going to generalize to new situations and settings across time. So just to recap where we've come from this semester, we've talked about internal validity, which is what caused the outcome in a study. What can we credit to the cause and effect relationship in the study? External validity is whether the findings we have in a study are going to generalize to other people, media experiences, and outcomes if we were to study those things again. And temporal validity is asking whether these findings are going to generalize across time. So even if we have a study with perfect internal and external validity, can we expect that those findings are still going to be useful and beneficial and accurate and informative 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 50 years from now? To just give you some initial examples on why we might think temporal validity matters and how it might inform even the way you're thinking about and reading research right now, we can look at an example like television. So if we think even just back to the 1950s, so I guess what is that, over 70 to 80 years now ago, that television looked a lot different back then than it does today. Fewer channels, often, families gathering in the same room and watching together. Programs were aired at specific times, and so you had to watch them at those specific times in order to see them. There was no on-demand viewing, or at least limited on-demand viewing until you were able to, record your programs and watch them when you want. And when we think about television in the present day, things have changed quite considerably. There's hundreds of channels and services. You can view on phones, you can view on tablets, you can view on laptops. You're no longer just confined to a TV in one single room of a household. Often what we're watching is guided by personalized kind of algorithmic recommendations on different streaming services. And you can watch these things, whenever you want, any time of day, any time of the week, based on your schedule. And so when we think about research that was done on television decades and decades ago, we have to reckon with the fact that the way television was constructed and consumed looked way, way different than the way television is constructed and consumed today. And so when we think about studies that may have been done in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and studies that have been done in the 2000s, we can ask ourselves, at the time, what was the internal and external validity of that study? And even for studies that had really good, really high internal validity or really high external validity, the question for us becomes, what is the temporal validity of those findings? Given how much we've seen television change from when the study was originally conducted to what it looks like today, would we still expect these findings to be informative or accurate or useful for us given the changing media landscape, given changes in audiences, given changes in how they consume television? So to what degree can we actually use those findings as informative bits of information for decision-making and policy and so forth? We can ask these similar questions when we think about platforms like Twitter, or X as it's now called. So even just more recently as the 2010s, Twitter looked a lot different than it does today. They had chronological feeds, so you were just looking at tweets in the order in which they were tweeted. There used to be character limits, 140 characters. Their user base, at least initially, was much different and smaller and more niche than it is today. In the present day, we now have X rather than Twitter, guided by algorithmically curated feeds. You're not limited to just text-based posts. You can do videos, subscriptions, there's AI bots and platforms and not just people kind of on Twitter kind of making these tweets and posts. And the users and norms and political environments that are available and shaped on these platforms is far, far different than it was in the 2010s. So Even research that we have more recently on platforms that were developed not that long ago, we can still ask this question of, given changes in platforms and in users, do we still find that these research findings, empirical findings that we might have from early versions of these platforms, are they still useful and informative for the platforms we have today? Can we still use these in decision making and policy, in guiding our personal decisions and so forth? Another way to think about this is just in terms of like audiences. And so this is a graph I pulled from, or a figure I pulled from one of these papers that has discussed this topic of temporal validity. And what you can see here is just the changing kind of fluctuations in who is using these different kinds of platforms. So when we think of something like social media, much earlier in the kind of the lifespan of social media platforms, it was really heavily skewed towards younger users. So younger people were adopting these platforms and using them at a much higher rate than older users. And you can see as time has progressed, the distribution of these different age groups has evened out somewhat. It's far less skewed to these much younger generations and more skewed to these kind of middle generations. And although these older generations are still only making up a very small amount, it's increased pretty substantially from what it was, far back in the early days. And you could also imagine that these types of patterns vary by platforms. You can imagine there's probably far fewer young people on something like Facebook today, one of these older platforms, relative to something that's newer and kind of hipper and cooler, such as TikTok. So not only are the platforms changing, but also the people that are actually using and engaging with these platforms are changing. And so would the findings that we have on these audiences that were using platforms in the early 2000s hold up and be relevant for the audiences that are currently using these platforms nowadays? Would we expect these findings to kind of generalize across time, given changes in platforms and given changes in users? The underlying idea here is that an excellent study can still become outdated, even when it has high internal and external validity, simply because it might have low temporal validity. And that's not necessarily something we're going to know at the time. We can't, predict the future in many cases. And so we might not know that these platforms or these findings that we have are going to quickly become outdated or become less useful. It's just something that's going to unfold over time, and we're going to find out. And in some cases, a finding that maybe wasn't useful at one point in time becomes useful because of changes in platforms. So we can sort of see this working in different directions. But in general, the fear with a lot of the research we're doing is, are we framing our questions in a way that allows them to transcend time? So a finding can stop being useful even when the original study was maybe completely correct or inaccurate of what it was describing and finding at the time, if the world just kind of shifts in such a way that finding is no longer really informing anything of use. We can even look back to an example we had earlier this semester. So when we were talking about the program SpongeBob SquarePants and whether or not watching that would impact kids' executive function as measured by this kind of silly head, toes, knees, shoulders game that we talked about long ago. So this study was originally conducted, I think, in 2011, and there was like a follow-up study in 2015. And so we can imagine, even in just this short window of time since this study was first conducted, the way that kids are consuming television has changed considerably. So this is a image from a national, what they call census report that they do every kind of 3, 4, 5 years on family media use in the home. And it's usually a nationally representative sample of families in the United States. And I just want to draw your attention to some of the results we have from when the study was conducted in 2013, around the time when this research on SpongeBob was occurring. You can see that really live television and watching television videos was still quite popular among kids. So they're watching about an hour and a half of live television and videos per day. But the way that's broken down is really just there's not that many different options kids have for watching television videos. It was live TV, or it was DVDs, or kind of video recordings, or whatever it might be. So back then, when this research was being conducted on SpongeBob, it was really live TV or DVDs, and that's how kids were consuming television. We look at the most recent report, which is in 2024, kids are still watching about an hour and a half of television and videos per day, but they're almost never watching live television. So about 5 minutes per day of live television. And they're scattered across all different kinds of viewing. So some are watching streamed videos through things like Netflix or Amazon Prime. Some are watching longer videos on apps like YouTube. Some are even beginning to watch like short reels, TikToks, YouTube shorts. Not so many kids watching DVDs as much as they once were. And so the ways that kids are consuming television has really diversified across different platforms and different kinds of content. And so the world that existed when these SpongeBob studies were being conducted has changed quite a lot. And we can ask, do these changes reflect on the meaning of these findings? Would we expect these findings to be different now that the way kids are consuming television has changed so much? And it's an open question. It's one that we could try to address with some research, but it's something that you always want to kind of have in the back of your mind, particularly when you're reading older studies of, do I think these findings have temporal validity? And when you're reading new studies, do you think that these findings that you might be reading are going to hold up over time, and why? Or why not? And you had a reading this week that was more of kind of a personal reflection of a researcher that was kind of grappling with this idea of temporal validity. He was a grad student who was noting in grad school he conducted this Twitter experiment in 2015 where they were using Twitter bots to send messages discouraging people from engaging in kind of verbal harassment against other people on Twitter. And they had some other groups of researchers that later tried to replicate the study. So they wanted to do the study again and see if they came up with similar findings or different findings. This is a very good scientific practice, and it's something that is widely encouraged nowadays. But in the time frame from when the student had originally conducted this study to when these researchers were trying to replicate it, Twitter had changed its platform. So these bot detection systems that they were trying to use, they could no longer kind of operate in the same way. And so the same research that was possible just a few years before was no longer possible or feasible. And so the questions that they kind of asked and answered in that study, there was no longer a world in which those questions and answers were any relevant. And you can still then ask, okay, well, are there other platforms where similar things might unfold that we could test? And that's sort of an open question. But the key point being here that you can run a study one day and then the world might be completely different in 2 years. In the way that you ran that study might not even be possible anymore. So that's a problem on the one hand of just being able to replicate. It's no longer possible to replicate, but it's also showing that already the value of those findings have kind of decayed over time. And so that brings us to one of these ideas that's implicit to this notion of temporal validity, this idea that the author of your reading this week refers to as knowledge decay, which is that the knowledge that we have one day might become less and less useful as time goes on. So the value of that knowledge might decay over time. And the reason for that is that research just takes a lot of time, especially some of these more complicated long-term studies that we might try to conduct. So maybe these big longitudinal natural experiments that we might conduct, maybe these intensive long-term experience sampling studies we might conduct, or these thoughtful kind of field experiments that we might conduct. It can take many, many months and many, many years just to run and finish these studies, to get approval to do them, to find participants to do it, to actually get them through the whole study, and then to have the results from a large enough sample to draw conclusions. And then after you run the study, you also then have to try to publish that study. So all the articles we've been reading this semester have been published in academic journals, and that's a whole different set of hurdles. So you have to devise the study, you have to conduct the study, you have to analyze the data, you have to write the paper, you have to submit that paper to journals, it has to go under peer review, it then has to get published and ready for production and actually put into the journal and posted online. And this whole process can take years and years and years. It can really drag on, particularly if you're having trouble figuring out a journal that's really interested in the work that you're trying to publish. And within that time, especially when we're researching these newer forms of media that are constantly changing, that the platforms that we're studying are just rapidly changing in the same period that we're trying to ask and answer these research questions. And so by the time even a study that you've run and conducted and written up and published, by the time it actually appears in a journal, the platform that you've studied or the way that you studied that platform might just simply no longer exist. And so the findings that you had might really quickly lose value. The knowledge that you've devised might decay over time. And so the knowledge we're obtaining in this research may have less and less value as time goes on. So I pose these next few questions just as a kind of rhetorical sense of thinking through, is that we can think of different ways of studying topics or different way of study designs. And we can think through like what types of questions are more or less likely to decay in their knowledge value faster. So we could think of studies on human memory, studies of human attachment styles, study of likes on Instagram. And if you look at these different buckets, you could sort of see just maybe implicitly that studies of kind of persistent things that don't really change much over time, like human memory or human attachment styles, romantic attachment styles, those topics are somewhat evergreen or somewhat persistent, or they're not undergoing substantial change in really quick fashion over time. Whereas studies of narrow topics, particularly on new technologies, like a study of likes on Instagram, could quickly lose knowledge value as those platforms change, or as the way that likes are presented or engaged with, as long as those change on a particular platform, and then the way they might manifest across other platforms might look a little different and even limit their value in that sense. And so by raising this issue of temporal validity, what researchers are trying to say is that we really need to figure out ways that we can still study issues around new media and technology and social media, but we need to try and frame them in ways that are going to be transcending time or have a greater possibility of transcending time. And so one suggestion people have offered is that these studies on new media really need to be framed in platform agnostic ways. So we shouldn't just be thinking about, studies of Facebook or studies of TikTok or studies of Instagram, or even in a more traditional sense, study of media, study of television, a study of video games, a study of virtual reality. We should really be trying to think about, what are the underlying psychological mechanisms and processes that we're examining in the context of these different platforms, in these contexts of these different media. In other words, what are these features of the topics that we're studying that seem likely to remain constant even as platforms or even as media continues to change? And these are big, difficult questions to answer, and they're tricky because we might not know whether or not we're right about the knowledge value of the topics we're studying until time actually passes and we can see what the future looks like. So I don't act like I have the answers to these questions, but what I want to point out is that researchers are really beginning to ask how we can really be thinking more thoughtfully and more purposefully about how to address temporal validity in our study designs. So not just internal, not just external validity, but what is the knowledge value over time? And so you have a reading this week that I'm interested to get your thoughts about, because it's a newer approach in how people have shifted towards studying social media in recent years, where people are actually going into algorithms and kind of tweaking features of the algorithm to see how it impacts users on these different platforms. And so I'm curious as you read this study to get your thoughts about any concerns you have or don't have about the temporal validity of this kind of approach to studying social media. Do you think that there's value in this approach, or are we in danger of quickly losing value by studying topics in this way? So this particular study that you're going to read is one focused on Twitter or X. And so another way of thinking about this question of temporal validity is, do you think these findings are still going to have value even if Twitter or its recommendation algorithms continue to change in the near future? So I'm curious to get your thoughts on these questions. And we're also going to look at some other follow-up studies that have kind of taken this idea of manipulating algorithms and tested it in some other sort of interesting ways. And so I'm excited to get your thoughts and to kind of think through and brainstorm with you, what should we as media psychologists be doing to ensure that we're actually asking questions that are going to benefit people 10 years, 20 years, 50 years into the future. So this lecture was just a pretty quick, nice introduction to this notion of temporal validity and looking at how temporal validity is threatening research, on media psychology in general, but particularly these studies of social media and newer media technologies that we're studying.